how does stress impact us?
Yeah. So, stress is a common thing in the lives of many creatures, not just human beings.
Mm.
Many creatures can get stressed when, for fish, for example, can get stressed when the water temperature changes. Mammals like whales, can be stressed when, the temperature of, or when pollution is, you find pollution in the ocean. Birds
Mm.
undergo stress when the weather's too hot, whether it's too cold, all these different creatures can do that. Human
Yeah.
beings are not unlike other creatures. We experience stress from many different forms. The blessing and curse of human beings with stress is that we have this creative mind that can make the stress even worse, right? We can imagine, we can over imagine, that stress, and we can ruminate it a lot about that. I don't know that there's evidence that animals do the same kind of thing. I mean, they have their stress
Mm.
period, they shake it off and they move on. Human beings
Mm.
kind of carry that, in terms of rumination and that introspection, about like, how am I positioned in this stress and what's happening to me, right? And that creative mind
Mm.
that can take off on itself and become very imaginative, especially if you've got, a genetic profile or gene variants that, like ADRA2B, which is an ADRA number two lowercase b. Some research has shown that, people with that, variants, a couple copies of those variants that have a reaction to stress, in a more profound way, more
Mm.
complex
So you
trauma.
mean predisposition, you mean? Like having a
Yeah,
genetic
yeah, it's a genetic. Yeah,
predisposition?
yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
genetic predisposition. Genes don't, are not destiny, but sometimes when people get into those epigenetic environments where they're around a lot of stressful situations, maybe people, maybe, the lack of money or poverty, those kinds of things,
Mm.
and racism or, colonialism or whatever it is. Any of the isms can really be a driver for the increased amount of stress that a person has in their body because of these particular genes and the epigenetic
Mm.
environment that contributes to that. So that doesn't mean everyone's going to respond in the same way,
Right.
but what we do know is that, from the research is that, that gene, particular gene's been studied because of that, because it relates to negativity, and because sometimes it can also be one of those genes then that people have a very difficult time overcoming trauma or
Mm.
overcoming stress, especially if you're in a particular environment that, as I said, epigenetic environment that sort of feeds it. And so,
Yeah.
that part of stress, exists for some of those outliers of people. And it's important. And that's why I think things like mindfulness and contemplative practices are very good for that kind of thing. But of course,
Mm.
and I think I know that we have to approach that with the trauma informed, practices and that kind of thing, taking that into consideration. So I think, we need to be trained in that way. But for
Mhm.
stress, what does it do to the human body? Well, I've looked at a lot of research. I've taken really deep dives into the research. And one of the things that I've seen is that, the
Mm.
body is so good at sort of priming us to say, something's happening, pay attention. And one of the things
Mm.
that in the brain that happens, that I've looked at, are the what happens to what they call dendritic spines that are in the prefrontal cortex. Dendritic
Mhm.
spines look like little spines, and they have these receptors that take in chemical information, and they're really related to memory and also related to a sense of well-being and a sense of kind of being balanced and that sort of thing. But what
Mhm.
happens when the body undergoes chronic stress, which happens a lot now in Western industrial society, of course, even the people that have the most are very stressed. The people that have the least, that are struggling, through famines and civil wars, those kinds of things, also have the
Yeah.
same kind of thing. So stress is a big thing around the world. So you can imagine that, what's happening to the prefrontal cortex, the dendritic spines. What happens is that there's a higher release of a protein called protein kinase C. Well, protein
Mm.
kinase C is okay, as long as there's not too much of it. It's kind of a warning signal. It gets too high and it's up there too long, it begins to break down these very delicate dendritic spines. Then
In
pretty
the
soon,
brain.
yeah, in the brain, prefrontal cortex, your
Mm.
brain then begins to suffer. Your memory begins to suffer. Anxiety, disorders happen, and before long, it can put you at risk for dementia or some neurodegenerative diseases. That's been looked at, in a lot of research. What we know, though, is that those dendritic spines, when they're broken because of this stress and the protein kinase C that's toxic to those spines, is that things like meditation or mindfulness practices can actually help restore those. When a person gets into a place where they feel safe again and the brain
Mm.
is not ruminating about all this stress and feeling that stress, repair begins to happen. Now we
Mm.
can't see that, we don't know that, because a person a lot of times, talking about stress may be, something that may be not in the protocol or the cultural protocol, of some people. They suffer in silence,
Yeah.
or no one wants to hear their problems because I've got my own problems, that kind of thing. So that's again
Mm.
another way that it manifests, in people silently, and it could be because the research says, when we have really good, stable dendritic spines, that it's a firewall against Alzheimer's disease and dementias,
Mm.
which could be, a reason why there isn't enough compassion, there isn't enough connection. We're not listening to one another. That maybe there's these rises in neurodegenerative diseases because of that separation we
Mm.
have with one another, because of that stress. So that's one thing that happens, that I've taken a look at and paid special attention to.
Fascinating. Hello there, and thank you so much for stopping by this channel. I hope you find this content useful, and if you do, feel free to hit that subscribe button. It will really help me to reach to more people and keep this content going. Here we are journeying together, and let's see where this takes us.